Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Kalayim, Perek Zayin, Halacha Hey, and Halacha Vav. We're learning today Daf Samach Vav. We left off on Daf Samach Hey on the base, 2 lines before the bottom of the Mishnah. We are actually going to begin in middle of the Mishnah. We had the first 2 dinim of the Mishnah, and now we're going to learn the final din of the Mishnah, which is that there has to be an earliest point, both in the grain and in the grape development, for them to be able to be rendered kalayim. Prior to that point, it's not called grain, or it's not called end, it's not called grapes. And the same is also that there is a stage of the end of their development, even while they are still connected to the ground, beyond which, not by the grain nor by the grapes, will we have the dinam of kilei hakedem, as we will see when we learn this final part of the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to basically, let's say, clarify each of the 3 dinim that we have in Halacha Hey and Halacha Vav, which will be the final Mishnah in Perek Shvi. We'll speak about the din of the Atzitz Nakuf versus the Atzitz She'einu Nakuf, a perforated flower pot versus a non-perforated flower pot. When you have such a pot laying on the ground or in close proximity of the ground. So generally the rule will be that we have a machloikes tanoim, whether we differentiate between them. The perforation, as we'll speak out, has to be a hole through which a small root of that plant that's in the pot will be able to go out. We don't need for anything to go out. If there is such a perforation, then perhaps the pot and the soil in the pot, and therefore the plant in the pot, will be considered mido oiraisa, connected to the ground with its consequences. Obviously, by kalayim, you can understand what the consequences will be. Is a person allowed to plant grain inside a perforated pot that's laying in the ground of a vineyard, within the avodah, within the space in which nothing else may be planted? Perforated, non-perforated, a person walking through the vineyard holding such a perforated pot within the distance of the ground, gavaldik, whether that will render the grain that's planted in the pot into kalayim or not. Really, the Gemara is going to bring a total, including our Mishnah, of 3 areas, both when we have Hilchas Shabbos, we're going to have the din of Hechsher Zeroyim, the Negeya, this Machloikes Tanoim, whether we differentiate or whether we say even a non-perforated pot is considered connected to the ground. The Gemara will introduce later a question, for example, what bracha do you make on grain that will grow in a unperforated pot? Once we're saying that if there's no hole in it, it's not called the ground. Do you make a hamoitz yilachem in haaretz? Gavaldik question. Or do we say that you can't make hamoitz yilachem in haaretz because it didn't grow out of the haaretz? We're going to have, let's see how far we're going to get. Also concerning the perforated versus the non-perforated pot. What happens if you have a plant that's planted in a non-perforated pot? I mean, it's movable, and the plant is going to be used by you as part of your schach, and we know that schach cannot be mechubar lekarka. Same idea. Is there a problem to use that schach, or is there no problem to use the schach? So we're going to have a whole big sugya concerning the atzitz nakav. We'll leave it at that. Can halacha hey. All right. So we had the first case in the Mishnah was that when a grapevine was cracked, and because of its new position, it's leaning over grain. And as we explained, that to say what normally we would say is correct, which is make sure it's no longer leaning on the grain. Pull it back. The Mishnah didn't say the words pulling it back because being that such a vine is going to die anyways, once you're chayiv to go there, you might as well, like the Mishnah says, yigdoir. And yigdoir means just break it off, cut off the vine. Mishnah speaks about the next case. When you have, and I want to remind ourselves the next case because the Gemara is going to begin focusing on the second case, that if you have grain that once it reaches a certain height, it begins to bend over, and now its tip is under the vine. The tip is under the vine. So the Mishnah is saying that even though you have to remove the tip from being under the grind, but if you didn't, it will not become kilei hakerem. It will not become asur bahana. That was the big chiddush of the Mishnah. That when it comes to the vine, what part of the vine may not be overhanging the grain? Any part of it. The vine, the leaf, the grape. But when it comes to the grain, our Mishnah holds only the stalk proper may not be under the grapevine. If the stalk is to the side, even though the tip now is under the grapevine, midoy raisa, it's not problematic. The problem is that there is a marasayan issue, and therefore the Mishnah says remove it. But if you didn't, Eina Mekadesh, and then let's go right inside the third K, 2 lines from the bottom. In other words, there is a point in the development, and we're speaking about both by the grain and by the grapes. Only if both reach that stage, the minimum stage of development, then can we say, kilei hakedem, because there is a foreign thing planted in a vineyard. If the grape did not reach its state of development, even if the grain did, or vice versa, then there won't be kilei hakedem. And what is that? So when it comes to the grain, and here importantly, you can already put your finger in the Shinui Nischos. We have 2 versions in the Mishnah, and we'll see this in the Gemara. One girsa is mishet kashlish, from when the plant, from when the grain reaches a third of their full size. You have another girsa which writes mishet kashlish, from when the grain took root, which is way earlier, prior to it reaching a third of its full size. So that's a big machlokes with big consequences. I just want to point out the hashgacha prat is that right behind Yakir, it looks to me that there's grain over there. That's what it looks to me. Something is coming out of the ground that's big. That's not grass.
Also not grain.
Not grain. Okay, but it's connected to our topic. When it comes to the grape, again, what's the size? So here there's no 2 girsais. Here there's 1 girsa. Mishayei asu kipul halavan. Once they become the size of a white bean, and again, the emphasis, guys, that mido eiraisa, both need to have reached the stage. Even if one did, but the other didn't, you won't have kilei hakedem. Now, we're not saying that you should plant it. No, you definitely should not. Let's say if I have a vineyard and none of my grapes reached the size of kapul halavan, God forbid for me to go ahead and plant grain. We're not saying that I'm allowed to plant grain. What we are saying is that if I've planted the grain, even though it grew, or if I discovered that it was planted and I would left it there and it grew to 200, it will not become kilei hakedem. It will not become kadosh because it's not yet grain. It's not yet grapes. Turning to the Samach Vav Amud Aleph, and just like we have the earliest point, we have the latest point. That means that once tvua sheyavsha kol tzarcha, yavsha doesn't mean it dried out in a negative way. It means that it fully ripened. That going from now on, it will not develop more, even though it's still connected to the ground. So once it's finished growing, and the same shear will be by the grapes. In other words, they are ready to be harvested. Since they are no longer going to be growing, if at this point, either or, so if the grapes reach that stage of their development right now, so it's not just you can't plant it in a vineyard. You can't plant a foreign seed in a vineyard when there are grapes growing. Once the grapes are fully mature, even if you're not going to harvest them, they're not growing anymore. Again, you're not allowed to plant a foreign seed. But if you did, you will not create kilei hakedem, meaning it won't become asur b'hana. Einon miskachois gewaldig. And again, I just want to read. I want to read inside the top of Moshe, because it's important to understand that this new din that we're learning today, it's either or. In other words, it creates a big leniency. Look inside the top of Moshe. Tvua sheyavsha kol tzarcha. Va'anavam shebishlu kol tzarchem einam miskatris oy ktanim. Keitzad im atvua yavsha kol tzarchem ubav not the gefen betoicha. After the tvua, I'm going in the opposite direction. You have a grain field and you planted a vine. Oh, you have a vineyard, and in it you plant the tvua or yarak or vegetable. Again, just like we had before, you're not allowed to do it. Ain't on miskachois. Okay, Gemara. Now the Gemara is going back to the second case in the Mishnah. Right, the words of the Mishnah are the second case, Tfua. If you have grain that because of its height, now naturally it leaned over and the tip is under a vine, a grapevine, and the chen bierik, same with the vegetable. In both cases, even though machzer, you should make the effort of removing it from it being under. In other words, like we said, it's an inyan of maras ayin. It's a rabbinic problem. But ve'ena mekadesh, why? Because the stalk has to be under the vine, not the tip of the grain. The ikar of the vegetable has to be under the vine for you to have a problem, not the greens that grow out. So the Mishnah writes v'chein biyarik. So the Mishnah says the same by tfua, the same by yarik. So Zajac the Gemara that not every Tana agrees with the Tana of our Mishnah. That uke ben Azai, but according to the Tana ben Azai, Yisaper means that if you have vegetables, he's only arguing in the case of the vegetables, that vegetables that will now, because of its height, will extend itself under the grapevine. It's not enough for you to redirect them, right? Which is what the Mishnah writes. It's not enough for you to be machzir. No, you got to cut it off. You got to cut it out because a vegetable is more problematic. And indeed, Achtani, the Gemara later, the Chevron, the Yeshiva, they found a Braisa that quotes that Rabbi Akiva Omer by the vegetable, the same that the Mishnah writes by the Yarak, which is Yachazir, the Nazai Omer, Yisaper. Very interesting. Why is that? Why is a vegetable different than a grain? So the Noise Kalim here explain it's not because.
What's the meaning of Yisaper?
Cut it off, cut it out. You have to cut out the tip of the vegetable to make sure it's impossible for it to lean under the grapevine. And it's not the pshat that Ben Azai holds that a yerek is more chamur be'emes, and therefore even the tip of a vegetable will create kilei akedem if it goes under the vine. No, we're going to learn pshat the way everyone here is saying that Ben Azai in principle agrees with our Tan of our Mishnah, agrees with Rabbi Akiva, that the vegetable's tip does not create really the kilei akedem. But since vegetables, some of them are very thin and very small, so when they bend over, you might not notice that they are bent over. And L'kula Alma, the Mishnah writes in our machzir, or the words in the Braisa is yachazer, which means you're not allowed to leave any part under the grapevine. And because of the unique characteristic of certain vegetables that might make them, to me, not even be noticed that they are under. So that's why Ben Azai says to prevent that, you gotta cut off the tip. Okay, weiter. And now the Gemara refers to the din that we began learning today. The emasai tfua miskadeshes. So the earlier stage. Now the Gemara had the girsa, the way we read it inside our Mishnah, misha tashlish, from when the grain, whichever grain you're referring to, reached a third of its full size of its maturation. Misha tashlish. So now the Gemara says that not everyone has that understanding. That is Tanoi Tanei. There are other Tanaim, and we read that Girsa and the Shinun Ischais, a much earlier shir, Misha Tashrish, that already from when it takes root, you got a biblical problem with Kilei Akerem. And this now, if you remember, the Gemara is going to refer back to a Mishnah we had on Daf in our pagination, Nun Aleph Amid Beis. And then we had a Gemara Machloikes Amoyroyim, Rab Hoshai and Rabbi Yechanan on Daf Nun Beis. And now we are linking these two Gersois with that Machlokes. Now, what was the case of Daf Nun Aleph Amid Beis? The Mishnah there was speaking about a scenario that no one biyadayim planted kalayim. No one did that. But you are standing, let's say, in your vineyard, or even if you're standing in your grain field, and you're seeing how the wind is blowing seeds of the grain that you are planting in your grain field. You are seeing it being carried over by the wind, and it's falling in the vineyard. So even though you did not plant it, since you saw it, that is the whole din of you're not allowed to be mekayim, kalayim. You can't maintain it, and you have to go and uproot it. And the Mishnah wrote 3 phases. That if by the time you got and you uncovered it, the grass grew, all you need to do is to uproot the grass. The Mishnah, uproot the grass. Now, uproot the grass, and could you use the grass? Or uproot the grass, and the grass is asur b'hana. That was a machlekes we had on Daf Nun Beis. Rabbi Shaya says that all the Mishnah is saying is you have to uproot the grass. But the uprooted grass, you can feed to your animals, or whatever you want to do with it. Based on what? Because his girsa in our Mishnah was misha tashlish. So since prior to any product of grain reaching a third of its full maturation size, it's not, it ain't a makadosh. If ain't a makadosh, true, you're not allowed to leave it in the ground because it's going to reach that if you're going to leave it in the ground, but you don't have to destroy it. That will be the shita of Rabbi Shaya. Rabbi Yochanan learned pshat there on Daf Nun Beis that when the Mishnah says even the grass has to be uprooted, he says, and the grass then has to be burnt. Why did he say that? Because Rabbi Yochanan's girsa in our Mishnah was not misha tashlish, it was misha tashrish. And the fact that grass grew out, grass grows only because there were roots. Let's read it inside. Man the amen misha tashrish, the ones that have the girsa that we found in the Braisa, that will be a backup to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan on Daf Nun Beis, that when you uproot even only grass from a vineyard, you gotta burn it. Now, guys, I want to add one nuance. You only have to burn the grass if you knew that the grain was carried by the wind. If you remember, if the wind blew kernels behind my back prior to me noticing it, even if it grew a lot, it will not be asur b'hana. Don't forget that. Because if there was no act of planting, if it happened, and I did not even know it, so therefore my leaving it there was not a violation, it will not become asur b'hana. But that's in the case where I knew it. However, Mando Amar Misha Tashlish, that will be the base to the opinion that we had on Daf Nun Beis of Rabbi Shaya, that once you uprooted the grass, you can have anah. Why can you have anah? Because the whole issue of Kilei Akedem is when the foreign seed became a third, then it becomes asur b'hana. Prior to that, listen, you're not allowed to plant a kernel. You're not allowed to plant even a kernel. Question is, does it become asur b'hana? That's the question.
Rabbi, the third is what? The average size? The average growth?
Of that plant.
That typical plant, okay.
Of that plant itself. So that was the minimum. What's the maximum? So the Mishnah says that what's the minimum by a grape? Still by the minimum. Only when it becomes the size of a white bean. So says the Gemara. Let's find the source. Amar Rabbi Hananya, the son of Rabbi Hillel. And now we're quoting a pasuk in Parshas Kisei, when the pasuk is speaking about the prohibition of Kilei Akedem. The Torah uses the words not kedem, but utfuas hakedem. Now, utfuas hakedem, which means that the produce of a vineyard. You can't use the word produce of a vineyard, as I given, you can't use the expression tvua, produce, only until it reached the size of a white bean. Why? What does that prove? You have to understand how much the Yerushalmi expects us to know. There are 2 dinim that we have in Shas that you have to remember to chap what we're saying over here. Number 1, guys, Boire Priyo Eitz. And that's something that we learned in Bavli Brachas, Daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis. Don't worry, I didn't remember. That's something that I read here in the bottom of the art scroll. That Tosfos says in Bavli Brachas, Lamed Vav Amid Beis, that from when do you make a Boire Priyo Eitz on an oven? Only from when it reached the stage of Pul Halav. So that's one other area where you already find. Now, why not? Why not before? Because it's not called the product. It's not a product yet. It's a pre-product. And then the Rashirilio brings here on 6 lines before the bottom of the right side, he brings another din. What's the other din? The other din is that there's a prohibition of harvesting tvua on the Shemitah year, and there taka the lashon is tvua. So from when are you biblically prohibited to harvest the grapes on the Shemitah year? Only if it reached the stage. So he writes over here of garua. That's the lashon we have in the Mishnayos over there. And we know that the yigra'u is a certain size Yigru'u, and our Mishnah's expression of like a white bean is the same size. So in other words, since the Torah says Tfuas HaKerem, and since we find in the Geya Brachos that for it to be considered the product of a vineyard, it has to have Kapul Olav. Since when it comes to the Isser of harvesting anything on the Shemitah year, when it comes to the applying it to the grapes, it's only from when it reaches the size of Pul Halavin. So that's why the Negeya, the Isser of Kalayim, the shear is also Pul Halav. Beautiful. Now, the other direction. The other direction is there is a certain point after which it will not become Asr Bahana. By Tfuah and by Geffen, it's the same shear. It is a Sheyavsha. Sheyavsha means it's fully ripe. Fully ripe means that no matter how much longer you leave it in the ground, no more growth. No more growth.
But it keeps getting sweeter.
It came in the saying it keeps on getting sweeter. Guys, make notes. Like I hope I'll remember. I want to when we're going, God willing, next Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, to the vineyard. I'm curious to find out. You know,
excuse me. What's the challenge of it getting sweeter?
It getting sweeter, I think, means it's not fully ripened. I understand at least that when the Gemara is saying sheyafsha, what's the words we have over here? Shebishlu kol tzarkan. So Yakir, the shebishlu kol tzarkan means it's sweet enough, or bishlu kol tzarkan means it's not going to get. There won't be a shinoi limal yusa. There won't be any change, not for the betterment. Maybe if it's still getting sweeter, maybe it's still included in the Kilei Academy. I don't know. I understand.
Also, raisins are sweeter. So.
No, that's not because it's connected to the ground. That's not because it's connected to the ground. I think if someone were to look for sweetness as a mila in grapes, then if it's going to get sweeter, then it's not called bishul kol tzarka. Maybe it becomes subjective to the intent of the owner. Like certain grapes, certain people, this wine, the grapes now are perfect. If this grape will get sweeter, maybe for what you want it for, it's a chisaron. Maybe that's it. Maybe that will be the shear. I don't know.
Rabbi, Google says the sugar content keeps going higher.
Rabbi, also
maybe it has to do with the intent of the owner. That means if I don't want it to get higher, that means for me it's a ready product. Yeah, Vlad.
There is a concept in winemaking called late harvest wines. So if you leave the grape on the wine longer, it does become sweeter. Even if it's a dry red. Got it,
Vlad. So let's go with that. So l'chu'ura, I'm saying perhaps if you are growing it for the late harvest, then you still have the Isser Doiraisa of Kalayim and it's going to become Asr Bahana. If you don't want the sweet harvest, because last year you have to embarrass from last year. You have to sell last year. You want to have the dafka not, maybe. Okay. So now when the Mishnah gave the Shiyurim, both the smallest and the biggest, one might have come to a misunderstanding and to think that since the Mishnah says the words Einon Miskachois, it means you can even plant. So the Gemara says, no. Keni Masnisa means this is what the Mishnah means to say. All the Mishnah means to say is, look how mikitzer it is, that Einon Miskachois, it doesn't become Asr Bahana, but you're not allowed to plant. That's what the Mishnah means to say. Look inside the Mara Fulda. It's 10 lines from the bottom, more or less. It's a little bit more than halfway down. Keina Masnisa, what the Mishnah really means is only Eina Miskachois. Kolamer Dafka Eina Miskachois. Avoli Sura Ikam. That's what the Gemara means to say. Doesn't become Asr Bano, but don't think that since the grapes reach that point, or since the grain in the grain field reached that point of Shiyafsha, that you can lechatchila plant a vine. Lechatchila, you should not do that. But it won't become Asr Bano. Okay. And now, guys, we are going into the final sugya of the seventh chapter, and we're coming to the final stretch. Again, we have an hour pagination. We're going to go until Daf Pei Dalit. We really only have 9 chapters, which means that somewhere tomorrow we're going to begin the second to last. But anyway, says the final Mishnah of Perek Shvi. And this is going to become, like we had yesterday, like we had 2 days ago, a much bigger topic then only kalayim. But we're going to begin with kalayim. Now, before we read weiter, I want to do something important. I'm taking out a Bavli Gitin Daf Zayin Amid Beis, and this is Gavaldik. There's a three-way machloikes tanoim regarding the topic of Atzitz Nakiv, Atzitz She'ena Nakiv. Atzitz is a flower pot. Nakiv means perforated. The question is, do we consider, beautiful picture, do we consider that the plant in the pot to be attached to the ground? Why is it attached to the ground? It's in a flower pot because there is a perforation in the flower pot. So first of all, whoever's looking at the Zoom, first of all, it's a great picture, but it's not a great picture. It's a horrible picture. Why? Because the definition in halacha of perforation doesn't mean the way whoever is not watching it, Kevin found a picture where there's 20 holes. On each side, there's 4 holes. No, there's a hole in the bottom. First of all, if the hole is in the or maybe not on the bottom.
That was the quickest I could find. Sorry, Rabbi.
That's fine. But in other words, the size of the hole, what I'm saying now is Lakula Alma. It's big enough for a small root of that unique plant that's in the pot for it to be able to fit through the hole. And I would argue that the type of hole could even be much smaller than the hole that you have, and you only need one hole. So that's number one.
Isn't there that the Rashi said that the all in is the nourishment? So it doesn't matter if they have hole on the side, but only on the bottom.
I would say I push it. I forgot. When I learned yesterday, I wanted to look it up. When we're speaking about a flower pot, Yakir, we're normally speaking about a flower pot that's laying on the ground. But even if it's not laying on the ground, I don't remember if it's 3 tfachim or 10 tfachim. There is a certain shear that we say that even if it's not on the ground, if it's a perforated pot, according to most Tanoim, the Chachamim who hold it's called attached. And therefore, Yakir, why do I have to have the hole in the bottom? Let's say the shear is 3 tfachim. I don't remember. So if you have a hole within 3 tfachim from the side, from the bottom, on the side from the bottom, it's a hole 3 tfachim from the ground.
I think you remember right.
Okay.
As far as the 3 tfachim.
Now I want to read like this. This is something.
Okay, but either way, his picture had a hole on the bottom.
Yeah, I know. Okay, I want to do something because I at least I remember learning this many years ago, probably when we learned Gittin together. Machlokes Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam Rambam. And this is really important because the picture that Kevin had was a earthenware pot. And it's minakotze la kotze, and then the Rambam is the most simplest. So Daf Zayin Omid Beis, I'm reading inside, I can go straight into the Tosfos. Divrei HaMaskal Otzitz Nakuf, whoever wants to open up can see. So he says, Perish Bekontris. That listen to what he quotes from Rashi, the Sfina Shel Cheres Eino Tzricha Linokif. That if when it comes to a klei cheres, earthenware is always considered perforated, even if there isn't a hole through which a shoydish cotton can go out. Because of the way that earthenware is made, it's porous. So the whole topic that we're learning now, today, and in other areas throughout Shas, Atzitz Nakiv versus the Atzitz She'ena Nakov is only, Rashi says, wooden ware. If it's a wooden pot, there we differentiate. If it's made out of earth, cheres, even though it's not a klei adama, it's already hardened in a kiln, it makes no difference. That's Rashi. The Rabbeinu Tam, now he brings this down to refute it, and I'm reading now in middle of the Tosfos. V'nidol Rabbeinu Tam lehepech, that shel cheres, the whole atzitz nakev and not is dafka by a cheres. The shel cheres boy in the kiva. Where do we? But he agrees with Rashi that there is an area in which we make no such difference. Lechumra, no matter what, it's called attached. According to the Rabbeinu Tam, shel eitz. The shel eitz leboy in the kiva, and this is negay because we're speaking about a boat. Most boats were made out of wood. And since, like I mentioned, you don't have to have it laying on the ground. There's a certain shear of within the ground that it's considered on the ground. That has a lot to do with all of the other sugyas. If you have something, let's say, Trumas or Maasros, it's growing on a boat. The boat is already in the territory of the Holy Land. All right? Is the boat made out of eitz? So, and if a boat is not perforated, let's hope your boat is not perforated. So that will be a big machlokes, Rashi Rabbeinu Tam. The Rambam never mentions cheres, never mentions eitz. So there, you should just remember that. In other words, Nachamal, Rashi If it's earthenware, it's as if it's perforated. Where are we machalik? That means according to Rashi, our Mishnah is only if the flower pot is wood. According to the Rabbeinu Tam, it's punkt faket. Wood does not need to be perforated. Every wooden utensil is considered perforated. Our sugya is only by cheres. And since the Rambam never makes a peep, not about eights, not about cheres, that's because the Rambam is not machalik. All he cares is it perforated or not perforated. And having said that, let's go. It's late. Says the Holy Mishnah. Here we go. I have a flower pot, and it has a perforation. There is a small hole, and it's within the area of the ground, whatever that area is, 3 tvachim or 10 tvachim. And am I allowed to plant grain in it? No. And not only am I not allowed to do it, if I planted grain inside this pot that's within the avoida of the kerem, it will become asur bahana. In other words, the chachamim of our Mishnah hold that a perforated pot biblically is called the ground. Mekadesh bekerem. And midoiraisa, mekadesh is midoiraisa. In contrast, if there is a pot she'eina nakuf, even though you should not plant grain in it, that's what we just learned. The Gemara says, Kena masnisa, eino mekadesh. Don't plant it. It's usher to plant, but if you planted it, it won't become usher bahana. Why? Because biblically, it's not called in the vineyard. You planted it in the flower plot. And since it's not perforated, it's called detached. That is the chachamim. However, Rav Shimon disagrees. And Rav Shimon holds, Shimon holds that if it's in a pot, the pot biblically is never considered, not never, almost never considered attached. A pot, detached. Therefore, it's awesome. They both agree that even when it's called detached, don't plant. But therefore, since it's not biblically attached, if you did it, then v'loy mekachin. So now we have Rav Shimon. So Rav Shimon, how great is that? Pikabala, Pipnimius. It's not called attached. Now let's go weiter. Daf samach vav amid beis. And now what we're saying is going to be.
What are you trying to say? A pikabala, Rabbi?
That you would think. I would have thought, Yakir, that b'chitzonius it's detached. What do we say about a yid? B'chitzonius is detached. B'pnimius we're all attached. He doesn't say that. He says the opposite. Oh, now let's go with the Tanakama.
Because Reb Shimon is looking at what's the real intention of this person. He's planting it in a pot. So in his mind, it's separate, whether there's holes or not. I think that's what he looks at.
I love what Danny is saying. And we had this by whole Shabbos. When we learned of Shabbos, every single machlokes, Rabbi and Rab Shimon, was dafka because Rab Shimon is the previous not of the world, the previous of the person. Previous of the person. What's your intent? What's your kavanah? That's the previous. Beautiful. Now, let's go with the Tanakama. Now, what happens? Hamavir tznaku bekeren. Look at this case. That I have a perforated pot. The Chachamim hold it's called attached. Okay, I'm walking, Yakir. I'm walking through my vineyard. Now, if the shit is 3 tvachim, I'm holding it in a position. I can be holding it near my chest, and I can be 10 feet tall. But it's a big pot. The bottom is within the 3 tvachim. And I have a big vineyard, and I was walking very slow after the way people walk after Cholent. You're not doing this on Shabbos, you're doing this during the week. And the time that it takes for the grain to grow at 200s, when we gave that shear, we said a half an hour, that's the time that it took me to walk through the field. So the grain was never near a specific vine. Kept on moving. But from the vine, there's a whole machlokes rishonim whether the vines will become asur bahana. But the grain for sure becomes asur bahana. Because I didn't plant it, so it's a din of mikayim. I should have walked in the opposite direction. I didn't care. I knew, and it's called attached. Here you have a moving attached thing. Gavaldi. So the Mishnah says, according to the Chachamim, of course, not according to Rav Shimon, it becomes asur.
But every step he takes doesn't he need to be close to 5 vines to make it a?
It was close to 5 vines. Kevin, you're on the right track in the Gemara, but what you mentioned, you're off. You're on, but you're off because I'm in the vineyard. I planted grain in the vineyard. Again, the Marav Fulda, it brings from the Rav and others, they would say that the vines can only become asur if you placed it on the ground. I understand that because that vine was not hoisted Masayim near the grain. But the grain grew while it was in a kedem. Who cares? This vine, that vine. Okay, now
getting nourishment as it's being moved.
It's getting the nourishment as it moves. Or it's not about nourishment. It was in a kedem. It was Meisav Masayim, and it was halachically attached to the kedem. It's amazing. Now, first we begin with the Brais. Says the Gemara Tani, and we're making a compilation of 3 dinim, including our Mishnah. We learned in a Braisa, Ein Bein Atzat Snakav, Atzat Sheinu Nakev. Where do we find the differentiation? We find the differentiation according to this Tana. Only by Hechsher Zerayim. So let's remember that when you have produce, something that grows from the ground, remember, the only time it could become susceptible to becoming Tameh, we're not even focusing on what is the source of Tumah, what was the halachic contact before that. For it to be susceptible to becoming Tameh, it has to become wetted. And there has to be Kiyitein Kiyutan. On top of that, it only is called wetted when it's detached. So says the Braisa, where do we find the difference between Atzat Snakav, Atzat Nakav? By Hechsher Zerayim, which would mean that if it's in an Atzat Snakav, therefore it's called attached. If it got wet, even B'Ratzain HaBa'alim, it's not called Mukhshar. It's attached to the ground. It's still Mechubar. If it's in an Atzat She'ein Nakav, there we say it's called detached. And that's the only area in the whole Torah where we have such a difference. So says the Gemara, according to the Chachamim, according to the Tanakama of our Mishnah, what are you talking about? Ein Bein Ella Kalayim. And we're going to see by Hilchas Shabbos another nafkamina. You know who is the author of this Braisa? Rab Shimon, and that will be a big chiddush. In other words, the Gemara says, Rab Shimon. According to Rab Shimon in our Mishnah, Rab Shimon holds that even a perforated pot clearly is called detached. We will see in Hilchas Shabbos clearly that Rab Shimon holds that even a perforated pot is called detached. Indeed, the other area where one might make a difference, and indeed the Chachamim do, is by Hechsher Zerayim. There, Rab Shimon is moided to the Chachamim biblically that an Atzitz Nakuf is called attached. It will not become Mukhshar, but if it's in an Atzitz She'ein Nakuf, it's detached and it will become Mukhshar. The Ram Kerabanan, but if the author of the Braisa would have been the Rabbanan, the Braisa never would have says Ein Bein Atzitz Nakav L'She'ein Nakav Ella. No, because Isa Chayranin, because there are other cases. What are the other cases? Let's go, let's move. Says the Gemara. Case number 1 is our case. Atzitz Nakav Mekadosh Mekenim. L'She'ein Nakav Ina Mekadosh Mekenim. I know this is not the Rab Shimon. I know that, but the Chachamim hold there is such an afkamina. Let me give you another case. Hatoy Lishmi Atzitz Nakav on Shabbos. When one plucks something out of the ground, he's chayiv one of the lamates malachas. Chayiv means if he did it b'shogeg, he's chayiv chatos. If mishe'ein nakuf, the Mishnah says, not that Rab Shimon, the Mishnah says he'll be potter. Obviously, guys, according to Rab Shimon of our Mishnah, whether he plucked it out atzitz nakuf or not, he'll be potter. Potter means potter avalasar. It's asur midrabanan, but he will not be chayiv chatos. However, indeed, when it comes to the hechsher zerayim, atzitz nakuf. Why not? Because anything that's attached to the ground cannot become mukhshar, even if it got wet. And even if it was beratzin haba'alim, it doesn't do anything. The chiddush is that even Rab Shimon is moed in this case. And why? Why is that? So now the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi Amalah Stam. Rabbi Yossi said the following, but he did not say where he got it from. Rab Chanina, who said the limud, he already quoted Mati Bey in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak. What are they referring to? It says in Parashat Shemini in my Tam. What is he talking about? It says Kiyipol b'nevlasam. The Torah's example of a something that was previously attached to the ground, that it becomes tamei. The Torah speaks about in Parsha Shemini the Shmoyne Shiratzim. Only the Shmoyne Shiratzim, when they're dead, do they impart Tumah. Other Shiratzim don't impart Tumah. A snake will not impart Tuma. But even when it imparts Tuma, the Torah says that Ki'ipol Menivlosam, that if the carcass of those 8 will fall on Zera, Zerua, Asher Yizoreya, the Torah says it's tar. Why is it tar? Because it's attached to the ground, because it wasn't Muksher. Now, Zera, Zerua, look at Zera, Zerua. Zera, Zerua means something that's in the ground. That's the way the Torah is saying. If there's a Zera that's still Zorua, Zerua, it's tar, because it's not Muksher. The problem is Asher Yizoreya is superfluous. Why does the Torah say Asher Yizoreya? The Torah should have says Ki'ipol Menivlosam. Al Kol Zera Zorua tar. Why is it tar? Because it's in the ground. It never became Muksher. Why are you adding Asher Yizoreya? You are including a new case. That is the source of the Tanit of Shimon, who holds that the Torah is being Mechadesh, that even if it's only planted in the perforated pot, it still remains tar, because it's called attached. It's called attached for the din, Lakula for the din of Hechsher Zeroyim. Guys, let's move. I want to move as much as we could. We have only a few more minutes left. Says the Gemara, we learned in a Braisa, if you have a unperforated pot, which means it's not attached to the ground, not only let Rab Shimon, even according to our Tana, Maisroisov, that do you have to separate tithings? So, and the word mahalacha means miderabanan. It's amazing, right? Sometimes halacha means halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Only mahalacha. And furthermore, even after you separated trumas from maasros, utrumasay eino midamas. If you have biblical truma, so the din is that if it gets mixed into chulin, mideoiraisa, it's not batal beroi, which is the rule. Mideoiraisa by all other mixtures. Here you have to have a ratio of 100-1. That's the way we paskin. But if you have truma that was separated from a product that grew from a otzitz, she'einoi nakov, even the chachamim, einoi nakov is detached. So it's only chayiv, mehalacha means midrabanan. So if it gets mixed with chulin, all you need is a bittul beroiv. You have to have a simple majority. But the din of dimua of 100-1 does not exist. And the final din is that if a non-kohen eats truma, aside of the sin, he has to make financial compensation. And the rule is, midairaisa, not only does he have to pay back to the owner, to the kohen, its value, he has to add a halachic fifth. But over here, he doesn't have to add a fifth. Now, Rabbi Yossi asked the question. Now, there's a big machloikas. We don't have enough time to go into the details, whether the Gemara's inquiry is on an unperforated pot or whether it's on the perforated pot. Okay? So we're going to go with, let's go with the Pnei Moshe, that is understanding that our Gemara, I want to make sure that I'm quoting the Ruhusu. No. We're going to go with the Manafulda. The Manafulda is three lines under the Gemara. He understands the Gemara, unperforated pot. What's the question? Unperforated means it's detached. So on that, Rabbi Yossi boy, Ma'al loimer al pita amoitzelachem in haaretz. Do you make a hamoitz? Now, what will be the alternative? People ask. To make a hadama? Well, how can you make a hadama? I'll tell you why. Because hadama means soil, ground. Haaretz means the ground. It's unperforated. Unperforated, maybe it's not called ground. I want you to know that Gemara does not answer this question. So what do you do? So just to know, interestingly, that in Orach Chaim, Siman Nun Aleph, if you Zion, the Chaye Adam, he quotes this Yerushalmi. Here it's the way he learned Pshat, the way we are saying it. It's an unresolved question. And he paskins the only exception where you will not make a hamoitzi, grain that grows from an unperforated pot, from which you make flour, made of bread, you will not make a hamoitzi, even though you'll make birchas hamazon. And that will go against the rule that if you don't make a hamoitzi, how can you make birchas hamazon? Okay, let's leave it at that.
What bracha do you make then?
Wow. Guys, wow. And one more line. Now, Rabbi Yoina boy came. You know what? Let me. I know it's late. Let me say one word. The Pnei Moshe learned that the Gemara's Rabbi Yossi was dafk on a perforated pot. He wanted to know on a perforated pot. That's the way he learns pshat. What bracha do you make? So to that, Rabbi Yoina says. No. There's no doubt. No. Why? That's not the question. A perforated pot, just like in our Mishnah, Das Rabbim, the Chachamim hold that what? It's called attached. Perforated pot. Of course you make a hamoisi on a perforated pot. What is my question? My question is The last that if you have, again, according to the Pnei Moshe, I'm going now not the way the art school is learning. If you have a perforated pot out of which is growing at the last has very long vines, and you want to use these vines as your schach while it's still in the pot, and the rule by Sukkah is schach cannot be attached. Do you go ad kedei kach? Do you go all the way until the end? Or do you say that no, we only find, like the Gemara says, 3 areas where we are mechalik? Klayim, Talisha on Shabbos, Hechsher Zenoim. Maybe not for Sukkah. I know I wish I can go weiter, but Kevin, what you touched upon about this moving vineyard will be the 3rd inquiry that we'll leave for tomorrow. We'll stop over
question,
here.
Rabbi.
Yeah,
If a wooden pot, if you're growing grain out of it, do you say hamotzi on it since wood is considered ground?
So Nachama, you have to put everything together. There's 2 questions you have to clarify. Look.
No hole. Doesn't have a hole.
When you learn halacha, first you have to determine whether the Marav Fulda's pshat is correct, whether the Pnei Moshe pshat is correct. After you make that determination, then you have to determine whether Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam, or the Rambam is correct. In other words, you can't answer that before we say you're skipping 2 steps. You cannot simplify halacha. That's the yigia of la'asuka shmaitza liba de hilchas. It's very easy when we learn Gemara. Hey, this one says this one says that. No, now what?
Do we make a hadama on cucumbers that are hydroponics, or we make a shahakal officially?
Or lettuce.
Can you, Danny, do me a favor? Find out